they can catch up. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session, which is entitled Transport-Led Development in the Midlands. We're going to be looking at a couple of key questions today. The first being, what are the transport needs in the Midlands? And secondly, what infrastructure is required and how can this be delivered? You've got three speakers today, each of which are going to do a short presentation on this topic, and then we're going to have a discussion-led piece with the opportunity for you guys to ask some questions. If you do want to ask questions, can I please ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen? It should be right down at the bottom next to participants. Please do ask them as you're going through. I will raise any that I feel need raising at the end of each session, or failing that, we'll pick them up at the end when we have the general discussion piece. So, transport needs in the Midlands. The whole issue about transport and what transport does for economy, both national and local, has been something that's been well known and recognised for a very long time. Back in August 2013, which feels like only a couple of weeks ago to me, but it turns out 11 years ago now, the government themselves recognised the economic benefits of transport being an engine for growth. And this piece is something that is then spoken about regularly. Only this week, there was an opinion piece in one of the major broad streets talking about this, highlighting the fact that the Elizabeth line, whilst it carried a price tag of £19 billion to open it, the expectations is it will generate in the regions of £42 billion for the UK economy, as well as driving renovation along the entire length of its route. It's quite clear that the socio-economic impact of transport north of London, in light of the fact that it hasn't been as heavily invested in, would be even more dramatic. Studies had shown that had phase 2B of HS2 still been on the cards, whether that happened or not, who knows in future, whether it might be reopened again, that would have brought about the largest impact to GDP than any other stretch of HS2. So I think it's very clear that when we're talking about what transportation can do, and when we talk about transportation, we're talking about both goods and people. I just want to make that point before we go much further into this, because I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to just talk about passenger traffic. It is the fact that we focus so much looking at London. And if we're not talking about London, at the moment, we seem to be focusing on the north, and it's recognised that areas around Liverpool and Leeds, some of the transportation structures are in desperate need of being picked up. But we don't tend to focus so much on the Midlands and what's actually needed in the Midlands. What is it that the Midlands needs? And actually, what is the Midlands? Because I think, again, that in itself is something that's quite difficult to pin down at times. Got to recognise, of course, that at the time of doing this webinar, we are a week away from the budget. And so a lot of what we're talking about today may hopefully be picked up in the budget. You never know, we might get some nice big announcements for the Midlands. And we've also got the spending review coming through. But hopefully today, between us, we can highlight some of the key things that we collectively would like to see in the Midlands and how that could be brought about. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Richard. Richard is the Integrated Transport Programme Lead for Midlands Connect. So over to you, Richard.
Morning, everybody. As Michelle says, I'm Richard Mann from the Midlands Connect. We're the subnational transport body for the Midlands, both East and West Midlands. So we've been basically funded by government to have our ears to the ground within the Midlands and put together strategies both for road and for rail and other forms of transport where required, to give the government an understanding essentially of how the kind of Midlands economy, politics, social, environmental aspects all work, and therefore what's the best ways of achieving economic growth, social improvement, and as hopefully there's some slides coming up in a second highlighting the government's first mission, which is to achieve good jobs and better productivity in every part of the country. So of course, every part of the country as far as we're concerned means every part of the Midlands. So next slide. That gives us an idea of the geography that we cover, everywhere from the kind of Welsh border to the Lincolnshire coast. An interesting mix of cities of varying sizes, but actually quite a lot of quite large. I've lost the light in this room. How? The a bunch of cities in the kind of centre of the Midlands, and then actually some more rural areas over to the east and west. And clearly, because we're the bit in the middle, there's London as the kind of big end down to the southeast, and Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool up to the north. But our transport strategy essentially has kind of got three piers, three main aims: to be fairer, greener, stronger. Though of course everything's within the context, especially nowadays, of being affordable. I'm going to focus this morning on the kind of the fairer aspect, trying to understand how we get those good jobs in every part of the Midlands. So can you move on to the next slide? We've done some interesting work here, trying to sort of understand how we kind of get that coverage across the whole of the Midlands, and both understanding quite how far people will travel to get decent jobs. And there's been some very interesting work done by up in Newcastle, looking at travel to work for different areas for different skill levels, and people will travel quite a decent way for better paid jobs, but there's a limit to how far they will travel, and it actually aligns pretty much to traditional counties. I mean, obviously things have changed over the years, but the you can see that actually that's a county hinterland for each city. Very much still works as a kind of as a concept for how we deliver good jobs to all parts of the Midlands, and you recognise some sort of more obvious candidates, maybe Birmingham in the middle there, but also we need to sort of work out how we're going to make to get some of the smaller places, some of the more peripheral cities to be functioning as good, strong economies as well. So one of the things that we looked at was what were the drivers, what are the things that actually allowed this to happen? Why don't companies relocate to Hereford or Lincoln in the way that they might do in sort of smaller German cities, for instance? What is it that they're doing right and we're doing wrong? And to a large extent, actually, what we found when we did the research was that you do need to deliberately set out to achieve this. Quite often, developers will not build office blocks, cities, because they don't see the demand. So actually, what you typically see is that cities have to invest in improving the quality of the land, building offices, often renting them themselves to start with, or pushing things out at lower rents for kind of commitments to longer leases. And that public sector investment in kind of office development is actually the thing that creates some momentum within cities. And what you need is actually a decent volume of jobs in the city, a sort of concentration of office-based work. And that's the thing that drives up productivity and then drives up rents, and then developers are quite happy for the prices to continue naturally, private sector led. And the public sector, so the public sector has to kind of pump prime that development, but then it takes off on its own. And there are examples of where this has been done very successfully in the UK. Bristol, Cardiff, Leeds, to some extent as well, have all managed to grow quite substantially in the last 10 and 20 years, starting off with public sector investment and then following on with the private sector coming in on top. And one thing that characterises this is quite often the development is around railway stations. That's partly because it's a nice, in some ways, a nice safe place for businesses to develop. It's a place where you can, if you've got your jobs, your office in one place, and you've got the ready access to other places, so you'll maintain links, and also with other cities, and also you've got that access to potential suppliers and markets in other places as well. So the critical thing that comes out of that is, well, there's two. There's one is that if these cities want to grow, there's a kind of path for them to do it, but it will require a certain amount of public sector investment, and obviously a whole question about where the funds for that come from. But on the transport side, we can actually help this process along by improving the rail services, particularly the kind of intercity rail services. So linking some of these slightly more peripheral places to other cities. And in particular to London, also where appropriate to Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds as well. So actually, the part of what we want to do and how we want to drive development in the Midlands is by having that sort of set of intercity services between the various, the 10 locations you can see on that map. And that should help effectively make what development there is more productive, and that will speed the process along on that path towards becoming self-sustainable within those individual cities. So a big chunk of what we're doing to try and get that kind of good jobs in every part of the Midlands is by improving that connectivity from the periphery into the centre, and also just joining the cities together with more efficient links. So next slide. We've actually put this together into a package which we call Midlands Engine Rail, fast services linking every city, with a focus on, obviously, for us, on improving the services within the Midlands, improving those connections from Lincoln into the cities in the centre, Shrewsbury, Hereford and Worcester also into the centre, and improving those connections between the cities in the centre as well. And quite importantly, improving those connections to and from London, because actually, like it or not, London's this huge draw, and improving the connectivity to London is often one of the biggest things that we can do to accelerate growth and the attractiveness of every city. So so if you go next slide, that's just to conclude. We've put into that together. That's there's a whole series of projects, about half a dozen projects now, that we're trying to progress as Midlands Connect, and we're not pitching for high-speed lines everywhere. We're trying to make sure we get all those kind of more modest investments that can fit into that general picture of linking cities together at multiple levels. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. Obviously, wearing my rail forum hat, I'm thrilled to hear about all the calls to have more rail lines running, and it's just interesting at that point to just highlight some studies that the Rail Delivery Group put out recently, whereby they said that when you say about kind of development occurring around a railway station, the stats are that on average £32 is spent in and around a departure station. So they equate that to being about £19 on the high street, £7 inside the station, and £6 spent around the vicinity. So I think that it's very clear that anything around the railway station is going to encourage some spending as well as growth. So thank you for that. We'll no doubt come back to you when we have the discussion piece afterwards. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Karen Monger. Karen is the Transport Appraisal and Evaluation Capability Lead for Jacob. So I'll hand over to you now, Karen.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Richard, as well, for setting the scene out. Really, really helpful. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Monger. I work for a company called Jacobs, a multidisciplinary engineering firm which operates out of different offices across the UK, including a fairly strong presence in Birmingham. I'm an economist by background, and I think that the focus of my slides is very much around the role of appraisal, leading on from sort of what Richard outlined in terms of the role of strong visioning, and particularly in terms of outlining the need for transport investments and how they link into delivery of growth and enabling development as well. I think just leading on from that, a key next process step typically is to take projects through development stage, and that's where I think organizations like Jacobs are quite strong around developing those projects and helping stakeholders deliver those aspirations. Maxine, if you could, or Martina, if you could share my slides, I think I can get into it. Yeah, so I think we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. The key context I think around here is that transport interventions and investments, I suppose, remain a key input into region's economy, just the way I think Richard explained earlier, and they do enable growth across the region. These interventions often are competing for scarce and very finite public resources. Hence, I think there's naturally a need for some appraisal, some economic analysis, and some other supporting analysis to allow stakeholders and us taxpayers to understand what value they would deliver for the society. I suppose, I think within that context, I thought it'd be useful to outline to the group what some key early decisions are to be taken, for example, around appraisal scope and appraisal stages, what makes a good appraisal, some very early insight, high-level insight in terms of the strength of strategic narrative. The government is naturally moving towards more of that type of evidence, rather than just being hung up with BCRs, benefit cost ratios, and then perhaps I think within that, moving from a strong strategic narrative, moving into the role of optioneering, testing options and value for money evidence to demonstrate the benefits of the scheme and how they compare against the costs. Testing deliverability on how strong these projects are in terms of being able to come online and achieve the aspirations and the visions laid by key stakeholders. And clearly, I think a very introduction towards an early sort of view around monitoring and evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you. One of the, I think, key early decisions within the appraisal remit is around what is the intervention scope. It can vary from the type of intervention. It could be a direct intervention into transport. There are multiple forms of transport. It could vary in terms of size of investment. Sub £1 million can also, sub £1 million interventions can also create the type of impacts that local communities would benefit from. But equally, I think multi-million pounds and billions of pounds are spent on large mega strategic projects, which could deliver step change type investments. So I think one of the key early decisions in there is to try and understand how big and how complex the intervention is, such that I think to try and understand how proportionate or how detailed your appraisal would be. Another key driver, I think, is to try and understand who the funding bodies are. The different funding bodies have got naturally their own assurance frameworks. Equally, I think they do back up to different central government departments as well. So whether it is a tag or a transport appraisal guidance based appraisal, or is it directly reporting into the Treasury for funding approval? So is it a Green Book appraisal, or is it reporting into MTLG for some development enabling direct funding, which may be sort of reporting into the former DLUC appraisal guidance, which should be rebranded again to MTLG appraisal guidance. And I think one of the key questions for often for scheme promoters and stakeholders is to understand whether they're submitting just a business case document or a pro forma, or both are required. Next slide, please. So in addition to those sort of early sort of basic questions, I think one of the key thing for scheme promoters to understand is at what stage are they entering into a funding program. Is it an early stage development, hence I think the need for a strategic outline case, or is it a latter stage of development where the project's already beyond the concept stage? Some initial options have been assessed, and the project's moving more towards some detailed design. So then it could be towards an outlined business case. The scope of the business case at that stage is very much around building on a strong strategic narrative, but creating a very, very strong economic evidence to start to identify what the emerging preferred option for the intervention is likely to be. And I think once you are in a space where you have got a preferred option identified, you're naturally into your final business case stage, where the focus very much shifts towards those delivery cases around the financials, the commercial, the management case, to try and understand the deliverability of the scheme, the readiness of the scheme to be on the ground and start delivering the outcomes and the outputs that the stakeholders envisaged. The ultimate sort of aim of the appraisal typically is to unlock funding. It naturally is predominantly from the public sector, but equally, as Richard mentioned earlier, it gets private match funding and other match funding from local government as well alongside. Next slide, please. I think one of the key sort of early starting points within the appraisal is to very much try and understand what your strategic case is, what's the need for the project, and within that, try to understand what the key contextual drivers are, like the economic, the market, the regulatory, and the policy drivers, and then following on from that to try and articulate what the case for change is. The case for change typically is to outline why the project's needed, what would happen in the absence of the intervention, i.e. the counterfactual, and equally, I think, defining why the project is not being able to be delivered in open market conditions, hence the outlining of the market failures, and then within that, the rationale for the public sector intervention. Public sector intervention could come in form of direct capital intervention, or direct intervention to deliver assets, or subsidize assets delivered by the private sector, or it could be other forms as well. But ultimately, I think the aim is to get those transport investments going, either through public sector or with support from the private sector as well. Another key element of the strategic narrative is setting out your logic model. Your logic model naturally flows from the case for change, where you're trying to understand what the key inputs are for your project, such as the funding, the design activities, etc. And linking to that is clearly the activities to deliver the scheme as well. And then ultimately, I think, to try and capture your outputs, outcomes, and the wider longer term impacts. That again, flowing from the logic model also is setting out your very smart objectives, very, very much driven by the central government requirements to be very specific in setting your objectives, be measurable, be achievable, be realistic, and be time bound. I think that's what the acronym SMART stands for. And then approaches to deliver these objectives inform the developing of the long list of options, which then get taken through the economic appraisal. Next slide, please. Once we have got a long list of options, given the scarcity of public resources, I think there's naturally a funneling of the options to try and understand what's the best performing option in terms of value for money. Typically, I think, depending on the size of investment, the appraisal process could follow from a simple test of long list of options against your critical success factors, which are naturally feeding from your case for change. The Green Book guidance provides some helpful starting points on how these critical success factors could be defined. And an alternative, slightly more detailed approach could be a qualitative multi-criteria assessment, like the EAST, which is recommended within the tag. And I think, depending on the size of investment, I think typically if you are talking about millions of pounds of investments and above, you're naturally required to follow a detailed economic impact assessment and then compare your economic impacts against economic costs. That process often requires, given the challenging nature of these investments, often requires to look wider than just traditional transport benefits. I think there's an example on the slide here, which clearly demonstrates that just looking at impacts from the transport economic impacts lens, typically pushed through the DfT tag guidance, may not capture the full value of the interventions. Hence, I think may not be able to tell the full story about the potential benefits and the impacts it will deliver to the society. Next slide, please. Once we have undertaken our economic appraisal and have identified a preferred option, typically I think the focus moves towards the deliverability tests, and I think around here we're looking at is the project affordable, i.e. are all the costs understood and the funding identified? What's the status of the commitment from the funders? How well the risks have been taken into account? All of that sort of naturally fits within the financial appraisal of the interventions. And if there are revenue generating schemes, I think their long-term sustainability in operational mode, particularly I think rail schemes, for example, becomes very important, because that early investment from the public sector is great to get the intervention delivered, but having a long-term liability on assets which are not generating enough revenue can add additional burden to the public resources. Naturally, I think that comes into the understanding of the commercial deliverability, and that's where we're looking at into things like contracts, procurement strategies, how they comply with the regulation, and a link back into the financial appraisal where depending on the type of contract, are the projects long-term sustainable? Often I think there's also a requirement to try and understand the social value of these investments. So through contracts, I'll be able to deliver some training or some skills development exercises, for example, for local communities. And towards the end, I think within the appraisal itself, I think is a very clear sort of method around looking at how the project's likely to be delivered, both in the implementation stage and the operational stage, that any risks around it and how those risks ought to be managed, and trying to embed monitoring and evaluation arrangements from the outset, something which I think Neil, the next panel presenter, would be touching in detail on. That brings me to the close of my my slides. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks ever so much for that, Karen. It'll be interesting to see how many of that changes with the introduction of the Procurement Act, where there's a move away from focusing just on that lowest economic, the lowest cost, and a lot more towards kind of that social principles side of things. And I'm sure we'll come on to that when we have our discussion. Before I introduce Neil, I just wanted to remind people that if you've got any questions as we're going through this, please drop them in the Q&A, and we will pick them up when we finish the next speaker, which leads me to introduce Neil to you also. Neil is the Technical Director of AECOM, so I'll hand over to you.
Right, we're unmuted, we're good to go. Morning, everybody. And thank you, Richard and Karen, really, for sort of setting the scene there. Yeah, my name's Neil MacDonald. I'm a Regional Technical Director with AECOM. Like Jacobs, we're a multidisciplinary planning and engineering design firm with a strong presence across the Midlands, actually, and across the wider UK and global market. By way of backdrop, I've got sort of over 20 years experience now working within the transport planning sector. And during that time, sort of built up a wealth of insight, I guess, over areas in and around strategy development, early scheme business case development, and more recently the monitoring and evaluation space, all of which come together to sort of give us a really good indication of what is likely to sort of drive successful development into the future. I think from a personal perspective, I'm absolutely a believer that collaboration and tapping into sort of hearts and minds aspects of transport and development delivery is a really important way of actually efficiently getting to the outcomes that a range of partners across the region are trying to achieve. I think the slides up on the screen, sorry. Thank you. Just flick across to the next slide. So yeah, I just wanted to use that's it, yeah. So yeah, I just really wanted to use the time we've got. Really, I could talk all day at this, and I don't want to put you through that suffering. So I think really there were sort of three areas that I sort of wanted to work on and discuss through. Really, one is around vision and ambition, understanding that stability and certainty is really important in driving development and growth over short and longer periods of time, and fundamentally sort of just reinforce the point of having a strong evidence base to help us drive forward development and growth. So they're the three things I'll pick up on. Perhaps just flick slides. So I think it's safe to assume that actually, the essay question that's set here, we can't just instantly assume that we improve transport, that means we're going to get growth. If only the world were that sort of simple. It does require effort, at all stages of that life cycle that Karen sort of introduced there, and some of that strategy context that Richard has set. I think, again, we could talk at length about this, and I think certainly shiny things are good. HS2 is an example of that. It has drawn a lot of interest and investment into the region, and equally when that sort of investment is taken away, then that creates challenges and sort of anxiety, I guess, around where and when to make certain investments. And I think certainly activities like the roads investment strategy delivered through national highways, all of the great stuff that local authorities do in terms of major scheme projects and initiatives, Midlands Rail Hub, they're all great examples of ways of actually creating the conditions for development and growth to happen. However, it's really important from my perspective that that vision's layered right down to community level. I think communities are, the predominant reason why we're actually developing the transport infrastructure or creating new places and attractive, high quality places. But fundamentally, by way of example, why should somebody who lives in a, sort of a left behind community, maybe somewhere like, I don't know, Chelmsley Wood, for example, in East Birmingham, get excited by HS2 or a big rail strategy when actually they don't really have rapid access to those railway stations? So it's really, or why should they get excited about the net zero agenda when actually they just want to know they can pay their bills and get to a job? So we really need to understand what's driving community need in any development at any geographical scale, actually. So it's understanding that, we don't fall into this trap of a gentrification sort of outcome where actually all we're doing is creating high quality places that actually local communities have no access and glean no benefit from. So we just have to have that at the back of our mind. And therefore, I don't want us to lose sight that when it comes to development and growth, the role of buses, cycling and walking, and even 5G and technology actually in that ability to support things like home working, remote working that's becoming such a key part of our working environment nowadays is really important. I think vision ultimately does, it brings clarity and certainty to developers, to local governments, to communities about what the future might look like. It helps us to sort of really clearly convey what our ask is to government and investors. So, every development needs somebody to fund it, whether that's in the public or private sector. The questions will still be the same. What is the return on investment, either in the form of a monetary benefit or a financial gain or a social impact further down the line, which, to be honest, in turn translates into finances also. I think vision helps people understand what the purpose and objectives are of development or the transport infrastructure that's going in place to support it. And it helps us sort of understand ownership and leverage positions of strength within that delivery setup. The local authorities the likes of Midlands Connect and other public bodies are really well placed to sort of navigate the political landscapes. Developers can come on board and bring in their design and their technical best practice and lessons learned from all over the country and world sometimes. And last but not least, coming back to that community and business perspective. So by communities, I suppose I'm talking broadly about residents and businesses and the customers of development and transport. But fundamentally, they're the ones who can really add the detail and ensure that our development, our transport, brings social value and long-term impact. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, just one last point on that. I should also just draw attention that actually development and transport don't sit in isolation. We do have a tendency, and I think it's a funding-driven thing in part, but quite often silos start to form, and actually solutions to development need can be solved within other government departments. It doesn't always require a transport solution to deal with an accessibility issue. Actually, when you come to big developments, investing in educational or healthcare facilities can actually help mitigate that need to travel and demand, and therefore tone down the sorts of transport solutions we might need. Sorry, yeah, click onto the next slide. So yeah, stability and certainty, really, they're fundamentals of everyday life, aren't they? At the end of the day, international money markets are a good indicator of that. Value, the FTSE goes up and down, and that's all down to certainty, okay, at quite a macro scale. But that fundamentally comes right down to regional and local levels. I think, another example, even on a personal decision making, if you want to buy a new car, for example, or some of the big lifetime purchase, you want the stability. You want to know that, that the job is there to support the payments of it, or that the vehicle is going to be, good enough standard for it to be reliable, etc. So, that stability, or you're not going to be priced out because you've built a big, heavy polluting diesel car. These are real decisions that people make, and developers, governments are no different. They have to weigh up the risks, and they have a collective role in sort of coming together to de-risk that investment and area. I do think the Midlands comes from a position of strength, actually. I think organisations like Midlands Connect, like the two combined authorities, and that ability to sort of take ownership of devolved decisions and starting to look at more holistic approaches to their various remits around housing, skills and economic growth is a real step forward, actually, and offers real opportunity. But fundamentally, that stability is key. And I think we use the HS2 example there. When you take HS2 away, it creates uncertainty. You could equally use the argument that the ongoing investment from national highways, into the strategic road net from local authorities into some of the last sort of mile type investments and major schemes, or an area, one scheme we've done in the north of England and Northumberland line. When you start to get those big shiny things, people start to see the investment opportunity. And that's my point there, really, at the end, is around when people start to see visible change, whether that actually be the investor or actually the community, you're more likely to get stronger support about it and keep that momentum going, and all those things we talk about, public health impacts, land value uplifts, and wider outcomes really start to come to the fore. Next slide, please. So really, just by way of wrap up, and I suppose I'm coming into, again, this is really, coming from two perspectives. One is having seen how the strategy development process works, the interactions across regions, national government, into local plans, etc., as well as seeing the other end of it around the evaluation and the outcomes we are actually seeing as a result of these investments. There's no doubt the stronger the evidence base we have, and the more we recognise there is a codependence between transport, development and other areas of public spending and investment, the more likely we are to keep the momentum going. That collaboration in delivery helps us understand where the blockers and the enablers exist, so that we don't, get stuck in this hiatus. I think we have seen it in other parts of the region. National highways have particular challenges around sort of DCO blocks, for example, around carbon, and that does again generates an uncertainty. Things start to slow a little bit when the brakes come off. People start to sort of engage again. I think that the last point there, just about review, reflecting, and anticipating. It's actually about understanding not just the immediate needs of the communities, but what are these bigger topic areas, around, whether it's around climate change resilience or blockers to long-term growth. There's a couple of examples in there, but the motorway junction you can see there is obviously linked in with the East Midlands Freeport. And I've seen from documents there that, the operation and functioning of the M1 in the vicinity of Junction 24 is acting as a real blocker to the growth of that site, because fundamentally the organisations that go in those spaces, they need good logistical connections. And finally, I think when that evidence base is strong, when the vision is strong and the purpose of what you're trying to achieve is strong, it actually then potentially enables more I'm going to put it, more controversial kind of policy decisions to be made. The likes of workplace parking levy in Birmingham, in Nottingham. You've got clean air zone in Birmingham, and other policies like low traffic neighbourhoods. I think a lot of the issues are in and around community engagement has really been really important. It's really important that communities, businesses, and residents understand what we're trying to achieve and what's in it for them. And the bottom line is cities like Birmingham, clean air zoned, businesses haven't left Birmingham, they're still coming. Nottingham, businesses are still being retained there, they're not being lost. So it is about really convincing people that actually there is often logic in certain things coming forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Neil. I think there's an awful lot for us to go at here, following on from the three of you and what you've had to say. Just remind people, if anybody's got any questions, then please do pop them in the box. But for me, just to start off with, I think what's really interesting about this is when we talk about transport, whether we talk about rail, whether we talk about buses, which obviously need, in some cases franchising, as we're seeing a lot more of the franchising of that happening now, or whether we're talking about road connectivity or cycle paths or whatever it is, we're focusing predominantly on public sector investment in some way. We have to recognise that we're constantly being told that the cupboard is bare at the moment, and as I say, especially with one eye to the budget next week, that we're not getting too many positive signs coming in advance of that. So how do we still encourage investment? How do we encourage private sector investment for something that would help as a catalyst towards public sector investments to recognise things? I'll throw that open to any of you, really. Anyone? I don't know the answer.
I mean, I think there's a key thing about the public sector government helping to get that framework stability that Neil was talking about in place, so that we kind of know the general direction, and it should make sense. It should just be cobbled together in a hotel room prior to a Prime Minister announcement, and then the department runs around for 12 months and more trying to figure out how the hell to put everything back together again.
Which of course never happens, did it?
No, never. And those last minute editing changes to documents just before they get published. I think there's an opportunity there for some of the key messages that have been coming out of the current government about creating stability, a context to growth, something which actually does look as though it stacks up. But I don't actually think you can get the private sector developing on its own without a degree of public sector seed corning. I think there's a certain amount that you have to do. You have to understand what the public sector can do, what it effectively can do, what it can affordably do. There's not really much point having a nice stable strategy that you'll never be able to afford to deliver. So we've been very kind of concerned to make sure that we get the kind of right level of investment in different areas, but a good spread, so that then the private sector can do its bit, kind of fitting in around that, and exploiting the opportunities that it can see that are harder for the government to capture.
Karen?
I think adding to what Richard was saying there, but also picking something what Neil mentioned earlier, I think at a macro level, that's creating that certainty in the markets, creating the free flow of money, money supply in the markets, as well as I think the right sound bites that some pump priming investments likely to be available. You mentioned about the cupboards to be bare, but yeah, I think something needs to come out in a positive way to get the private sector excited again. And I suppose I think at a micro level, it's definitely around, again, overcoming that uncertainty. So there could be site related issues, for example, abnormals on the site. Neil mentioned about the wider infrastructure requirements which go beyond transport and trying to break those silos down, so greasing the wheels so that different public sector bodies are talking and the private sector can take that investment through. Those are, I think, just additions to what I suppose I think Neil and Richard have already mentioned.
Thank you for that, Neil.
Yeah, just to add to that, really, I think, I alluded to it there in the presentation, really, around de-risking the environment for the developer. We should not lose sight that developers are in development because they need to make profit and returns. They're slightly differently motivated, but, the outcome in some way, having the houses is very similar. So I think there is about, things like some of that early removal of some of the real obstacles around a particular development site, for example. So is it that you've got a perfectly good sensible development site, but actually it's got some land contamination issues? How do you remove those? Do you take some of those blockers away, or you've got a real transport pinch point that simply the site and the intended purpose of that site is not going to work unless you remove that blocker or that constraint. On the other hand, you could also say actually the importance of local plans and making sure that when we're looking at the intended purpose of that land, that purpose is aligned with some of the conditions of it and prerequisites in and around the network. I think the other point as well is actually where the vision piece comes in. Having a longer term vision that spans 5-10 years, maybe, it sets that framework out for people to have the confidence. We know where we're trying to get to, but what it should also be doing is saying, well, actually, we can't deliver all of that in one big hit. Finances is one huge reason why you can't do that. Skills and capability in the industry and capacity within the industry is probably one issue. You've got the ability to construct the houses, and the talent, that's needed to build these new buildings. There's lots of reasons that stop us and slow us down. But ultimately, what it does enable you to do is to chip away at it. And actually, that you're adding on, on top of each other. And, I'm just to use one primary example we've been involved with on a monitoring and evaluation piece. The Southern Link Road around Worcester is an example of where they progressively delivered that scheme. They didn't deliver it in one big bang. They've just put in phase 4 now, which gives them a real strong bit of connectivity around the south side of Worcestershire. It starts then to bring in Malvern and some of these rural parts of the region. But that was a step-by-step process. There's aspects of Birmingham and other cities like Nottingham that are doing the same sort of thing.
And I'll put a slightly contrary view in some ways, which is that sometimes we overcomplicate things in the public sector, and actually, when it works, we don't actually need to go through every little detail. What we're seeing in kind of Birmingham and also Manchester and Leeds is very strong private sector led development. And it's not actually required that much of a hint of a possibility of HS2 to get a lot of these things happening. Because there is, I mean, clearly there's pressure in London. Land costs are very high. Housing supply is very constrained, and actually business can see that it's much easier in many ways to do these developments in other large cities. But what we need to do is not stop undermining them by chopping and changing all the time. But actually the private sector can be very strong and a very strong driver, much easier to get things off the ground with the private sector in many ways than with the public sector, which could be endless arguments internally.
It's something of a chicken and egg, isn't it, really? Because and we've all recognised today, and when we've had previous discussions between us, that actually transport is that enabler for growth. So you almost need that to happen first. Build it and they shall come. It's that thing, whether that's moving people so that they can go to better paid jobs, which means that they have more money to spend in the local area, or more money to spend on leisure, more money to spend on new houses or new cars, or whatever it is. I think just referring back to the Elizabeth line Crossrail example that I gave earlier on, the amount that it cost, but then the amount that it's going to bring. And I think that if you go back however many hundreds of years, would we have built the London Underground if we were looking for an immediate return? That kind of 5-10 year return piece, we wouldn't have done it. Karen?
Just adding to what Richard was saying there around sort of the public sector making things a little bit more complicated and a little bit more complex when things could be resolved a lot quicker and a lot more smoothly. I suppose I think that the role of transparency in that space, in open exchange of information, things like open book accounting, particularly when it comes to like individual projects and so where public funding is involved, I think that's where if there is that commitment to transparency and open book accounting, I think then the complications could be mellowed down. But equally, I think when I mentioned earlier in my slide deck, different funders and their assurance requirements sometimes can be very onerous, and that could be very, very off-putting, particularly to the private sector, who already have their own internal rigorous processes. I think those processes can act as a hindrance.
Looking at the questions, I think that we may have answered these, but to what extent do you think the strong evidence base and de-risking certainty comes through the local plan making process, and how will reforms impact that evidence base?
It's always a balance, because nothing's ever very certain. Lots of developments fall through, lots of ideas come and go. Governments obviously change, but in many ways that richness of data is often the thing that can help shape something that's comprehensive and can adapt to future change. But it's always a challenge. You're always searching for the perfect when it never really exists.
Yeah. I think, I think I've said it several times now. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the local plan is, sort of right at the front end of the whole sort of cycle, isn't it? Really, and it is a cycle, and there is a feedback loop. But planning authorities and the highway authorities, whether that be at the local level or strategic road network, having that cohesive view of actually what place or what types of places are we trying to create. What are their respective roles in delivering that vision? I think is absolutely critical for setting stability and vision. Because I think actually if there is a confused picture around what local authorities may be putting out there as their vision, then it creates confusion right through the process. So actually nipping it in the bud and getting it sorted right from day one is the ideal. I'm not saying it. And I was going to use the point that actually vision and agreeing vision doesn't always mean consensus. I think it's trying to find those common areas of common ground and going, well, actually, we want that, you want that, we're trying to achieve the same thing, and just working on those common ground areas. But also there's then competing from a local plan point of view. You start to then sort of you look at cities and their breakdown into districts, that then starts to become all sorts of complexities as well between, you know, who's putting the houses where, and if there's a collective burden around the number of houses you can build, where do you put it? Oh, well, Bromsgrove will take a load of your Birmingham housing targets, etc., etc. It gets really complicated. But again, that's the sort of visioning piece that really needs to be understood and agreed as far as practically possible.
I'm conscious of time because I understand that 11 o'clock the drawbridge comes down and we all get kicked off. And I think what was demonstrated from when we had a conversation about all of this the other day is that we could collectively talk about this for ages. There is lots that we haven't picked up on. So what I'd like to do is just end up in our final 3 minutes with just kind of the exam question to each of you, which is, so what are transport needs in the Midlands? And what do we need to do to get this delivered? So I don't know which one of you wants to pick that one up first.
Well, shall I go first? I think I'd just slightly controversial in some ways say that the big thing we need isn't even in the Midlands. We actually need the government to make a decision about HS2 going to Euston, so that we've got a coherent scheme. Then we can build all the rest of it, but actually understanding that we've got that framework of what HS2 is broadly going to deliver, and then we can have everything else that fits in it. We end up doing an awful lot of work, aiming in one direction, then going sharp turn, aiming in a different direction. So we can get that basic decision out of the budget coming out. We've got a good ground for developing all the other plans.
I'm sure the Secretary of State would love to hear that HS2 is a basic decision, but passing on to Neil and Karen.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay, sorry, technical issues there. Yeah, I think from my point of view, sounded like a stuck record, really. I think there is getting that vision right. And I think we are in a bit of a position at the moment with the change of government, some potentially significant changes in government thought. We need to quickly get that vision refined. We don't tear up and throw away everything, but we quickly update and refine. And we need to communicate that out to all of the parties involved so they can understand how they can deliver that piece. I think new shiny things are always going to be good for the region. Absolutely support everything we do from a strategic transport infrastructure point of view. We're right in the heart of the country, so actually everything we do carries a national significance as well. So I think actually, you know, bringing in those new shiny things will help build confidence, but don't lose sight of the local community space, and that actually, if I'm sat in an area and I'm really struggling, HS2 might not be the thing that I'm really excited about, but actually I might be excited about the bus connections that then will come.
Yeah.
By way of example.
Sure. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, very quickly. I think I would say I think markets are always looking for signals, and in terms of signals, the two strongest signals for me would be a continuity of availability of funding going forward to support delivery of transport investments, and I think the second thing would be planning reform. That could be a whole huge topic in its own right.
Fabulous. Right. Well, look, thank you very much, everybody. As I say, we could have spoken about this forever, and we didn't even touch on freight and you know, the role that freight can play in all of this as well. So I think at this point I'd like to thank each of you for your contributions today. I think it's been really worthwhile, and to thank everybody that's dialed into this. Obviously, if you have any questions that you would like to direct to any of the panel, I'm sure that you can do that through Waterfront if you have any off the back of this. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.